Let me start with you, Dr. Carnevale, and I will profess right at the outset to have long been an admirer of your work and the scholarship you've done in the education field. And I'd like to ask you a question in a sense about where we are in terms of higher education policy, because I believe we're in something of a fork in the road. Higher education policy has always been about access. And I certainly don't take a backseat to anybody in terms of access, and particularly ensuring that our young people can get access to Pell Grants, Stafford loans, and the array of programs that ensure that they get in the door, that they can actually get into college. I think, however, that we're now moving to a day when we're going to look at a policy that I, in effect, call Access Plus, so that we also say it's extraordinarily important that students get more value for their education, because this is going to be, after buying a house, our second biggest expenditure. And Senator Rubio and I have introduced a bipartisan piece of legislation. There are other approaches that in many respects are similar, and we've been able to get support across the political spectrum, from very progressive groups to conservative organizations. And my understanding is you're a longtime advocate for transparency. We've said young people should be able to find out about graduation rates and remedial education, and particularly be in a position to get some sense of what they would be likely to earn when they got a degree from a particular school. In advocating for transparency, what have you seen as the primary opposition over the years, and what are the principal arguments to counter that?
There is I agree with you, we've hit a fork in the road here. Part of it has to do with fiscal constraint, that is, we don't have any money. And the other part has to do with the fact that the role of higher education has changed. It's now our workforce development system. And that has a real economic history, beginning in 1983, when it all began to accelerate very rapidly. The opposition to the notion of transparency, of telling people, as your bill says, giving people the right to know before they go, what the outcome is likely to be of their program, the opposition comes at a value level, a normative level, and it's the most difficult piece of it, because higher education leadership sees itself as an institution that's supposed to help people live more fully in their time. A very broad goal. I doubt many of us disagree with that. But the reality now is that in order to get a decent job, you've got to get some higher education, and whether or not you get a decent job or how good the job is depends on what you take. So, and given increasing prices and loans and all the rest of it, I think we need to start telling people this. And in the end, my bias is that in this culture and economy, you can't live more fully in your time if you're living under a bridge and out of a shopping cart. That is, people need to know that their education is going to give them gainful employment at the end of the day. Doesn't mean they shouldn't take English or study the role of feminism in the French Revolution. Just means that they need to know what they're going to do with that after they graduate, because they're going to be doing that for the next 45 years of their life after breakfast every day.
Well said. I would ask you more questions if I had more time, but thank you again. We're going to be working very, very closely with you, and staff is very appreciative as well. Ms. Trottenberg, welcome, and you won't be surprised that I want to talk about infrastructure spending, and particularly about new approaches that can support a bigger role for the private sector. And for literally a decade, I worked with a number of Republicans to put in place the Build American Bonds program. And on the night of the debate about the Recovery Act, Senator Grassley and Senator Baucus, who I think as much as anything had heard me talk about this so often, they said, well, let's look at this because Ron has been bringing this up for eons. They said, well, so what's going to happen with Build America Bonds? I said, well, we've got maybe a year and a half. We might generate $4 or $5 billion worth of investment. And everybody said, oh my goodness, we've never done bonding at the federal level before. And he thinks we'll get $4 or $5 billion worth. That sounds terrific. As you know, Build America bonds in a year and a half generated $180 billion worth of investment, a 30-fold increase beyond anything that was projected. And I just think that given the fact we've got all of this work that needs to be done, and you cannot have a big league period of economic growth with little league transportation systems, that we're going to keep coming back to what are the effective ways to fund infrastructure. Now, Senator Hoeven and I have teamed up on an approach that really is quite similar. We call it TRIPS bonds, to in effect have federal tax credit bonding to leverage private dollars for investment in infrastructure. And I don't know of any other approach that will drive down the costs more and increase the private sector role in transportation than this particular concept. And we've talked to you all many times, and I'm encouraged that you all seem to be moving in that direction as well. The America Fast Forward bond program, it seems to me, sort of tracks the bipartisan efforts up here in terms of trying to look at these kinds of approaches. Am I reading this right, or what's your sense of it?
Absolutely, and certainly thank you for your leadership on the Build America bonds. As you pointed out, it was wildly successful and brought in a enormous new.
Well, I think, by the way, excuse me for interrupting, I think Alan Kruger deserves a lot of credit for this because, as you know, there was a lot of pushback, early on, and he really prosecuted the case. And, excuse me for interrupting.
And brought in, obviously, tremendous new classes of investors who couldn't benefit from traditional municipal bonds. And, we in the department now have several programs which are somewhat along those lines. We have the private activity bonds, where essentially we use them to incentivize the private sector to develop projects which have very clear public benefits. We're looking for ways to increase the use of that program. And as Congress has given us the expanded TIFIA funds, we're finding more and more that project sponsors are coming to the department wanting to make use of both of those programs in concert. And clearly we're well familiar with your TRIPS program, Senator Wyden, and I think we're very keen to work with you, and we're thrilled there's so much bipartisan support here in Congress on how we can continue to broaden the pool of investors that want to come in and invest in infrastructure. Obviously, from the Treasury's point of view, make sure we do it in the way that is the most efficient. And I know that's, one question that we have is how we set the subsidies, the interest rates, whatever it would be, so that we're using the taxpayer dollar as efficiently as possible. But clearly, we're going to need to bring in much greater private sector investment and participation to close the gap on what we need in terms of infrastructure.
Well, I'm going to look forward to following up with you, Ms. Trottenberg, on it, because I think particularly when you look at something that can attract private sector support, it has significant support from labor union groups. Doug Holtz-Eakin, as you know, has said dollar for dollar, he thinks this is the attractive approach in the transportation field. Given the President's comments in the State of the Union, and I thought he was spot on in terms of talking about infrastructure and roads and bridges and rails, I really hope that this is an area that can become a prime focus of your work, because I may be missing something, but I just look around. There are no rallies outside my office calling for increases in the gas tax, for example. It's going to be increasingly difficult to find approaches that are substantively sound and politically viable. And I think that this concept that we're talking about in terms of trying particularly to look at tax credit, bonding is something that holds the tariff down on the federal side. I noted your comments earlier with respect to infrastructure, and is the one that the private sector is saying looks flexible and appealing. So we're anxious to work with you on it. Let me talk a little bit about health care and taxes, and we'll kind of go into your area, Mr. Malpass, and have followed your comments as well. Suffice it to say, the debate about the sequester, when you really strip it down, has largely been because there has not been agreement in health care and taxes. Those are the two kind of driving kinds of areas. And my sense is, let's take them separately. that I just came from the Finance Committee where we were talking mostly about the healthcare issue, and may be able to get back to talk about tax reform, that again, there's some opportunities to bring people together. For example, the latest evidence on Medicare, which the costs have gone down a little bit here recently. We're pleased to see it, but I think we all understand the demographic tsunami that we're dealing with. 70% of the Medicare spending goes to treat those with 3 or more chronic conditions. So you get into a strategy that will promote quality of care that the seniors deserve with a strategy that'll hold down costs. You go a long way to trying to address the agenda for Medicare reform. The accountable care organizations are clearly a step in the right direction. We have them in our part of the world long before anybody thought about them at the federal level. But what's your sense in terms of particularly looking at chronic care as a key element of Medicare reform, and also creating incentives for those on the program for holding costs down as well?
Thank you, Senator. I'm not going to be able to respond as an expert on the chronic care issue. And so I'll look to colleagues on the panel for that if they have comments. But I think your point is excellent about how do we find a way to make reasonable choices within the Medicare program, and that it has a massive impact on the budget consequences. And so right now we're in this impasse where we end up with a sequester, which, you know, Republicans aren't claiming invention of that idea either. And so how do you, and you've been a leader in trying to find ways to work across the aisle to find a way to break the impasse. My own view is that we're at a point where there needs to be some spending restraint, some agreement that there could be some spending restraint, and that might then break the logjam on taxes and on revenues. But right now, excuse me, on revenues and on healthcare. But right now, the nation kind of is waiting for Washington to find a single program that it thinks could be downsized. That would be the starting point for the debate discussion.
Let me do this, because staff tells me that we kind of got to wrap up and get out the door here. On tax reform, I will pose this to you in writing. One of the things that we're asking experts in the field is to identify the tax expenditures, which is, of course, spending in any kind of literal sense, that they think ought to be either altered or removed altogether as a way to generate the opportunity for tax reform. I've had an approach with Senator Coates and Senator Begich and Senator Gregg and others over the years. I think we all understand after what we were dealing with in terms of special committee and also Bowles-Simpson, that much of this is the challenge of modernizing what a big group of Democrats and Ronald Reagan agreed to in the 80s. It created millions of jobs and psychologically gave a big boost to the economy. So I would ask you more questions if time allowed, but I will put in writing to you a question asking you, on the basis of your expertise, to identify the tax expenditures that you think ought to be changed or eliminated.
And if I may, just one point: if the tax credits could be used, any savings could be used to reduce the overall rate, let's say on the corporate side, if that were proposed and became a concept, it would be hugely pro-growth.
Very good. With that, the Budget Committee is adjourned.
Thank you, sir.